E3 is dead, officially and finally, with no apparent signs of any hope of a resurrection, and very few of us, if any, are shedding any tears over it. Though the reason why it died does bear a little bit of closer scrutiny, because here's the thing. E3 died in part because it was simply just outdated in the days of the modern internet, right? If developers can simply just make their own press conferences, create their own events, and host them all online, as they did during, that little period of goof, then why not? It's a hell of a lot easier, it's a hell of a lot cheaper, and they get to control the narrative 100%. There's almost nothing but benefits. However, this in and of itself is not the reason why E3 eventually went tits up. No, the reason for that is because E3 forgot its audience. Because large trade conventions like this are still quite commonplace in many other areas. Robotics, for example. And E3 could have continued to be an enormous nexus of interest around video gaming had it but remembered who it actually served. So, let's talk about this a little bit. Originally, of course, E3 started out as a trade convention, where people within the business of making video games could gather and network and talk to each other and create plans and job opportunities and all of that good stuff, like a way to scout some talent as well, right? But this obviously wasn't going to keep the wheels turning around. Plus, this was a new, young, vital and energetic industry that genuinely did want to engage with its fans because the people making the games were themselves fans of it. And so it turned into a celebration of video gaming. This was E3 at its most beautiful, when it was simply just fans of video gaming gathering together to be fans of video gaming. This was the audience that E3 needed to serve. And they forgot about that actually fairly early on in its existence. One of the first and most obvious things, because this was a long and slow and drawn out process, right? Many of you might remember back in 2006, I believe, a prehistoric era where E3 decided to ban scantily clad booth babes. Many of you might not even have heard of booth babes, as this was very much so in the early days before we had any understanding of what was happening to, well, anything. Like, feminism was taken at its face to simply be like, oh, well, you don't want to oppress women, do you? It's like, no. Is this oppressive to women? It's like, yes. Oh, okay then. I guess we agree. And so the booth babes were banned. Now, the booth babes at the time didn't seem like a big deal at all. It seemed utterly and entirely inconsequential, right? Alright, so you're not gonna have scantily clad chicks wandering around your stages. Not a big loss, right? But this was kind of indicative of the nature of the celebration. This was, of course, an overwhelmingly male hobby, is still today an overwhelmingly male hobby. And the reason why the companies had, well, booth babes was because men, their primary audience, enjoyed looking at them. I know, shocking, right? And the idea was, of course, okay, this will be way more inclusive, okay? If we just get rid of this, we'll get rid of that toxic male masculinity, and people will embrace our hobby even wider. Okay, a worthy experiment, let's try. And because this was evil, right? This was condemned very much so by the movements of the time. Paxmos, in outright banning the use of booth babes at this event, E3 and Gamescom must follow his lead on this offensive anachronism, says Patrick Gaddett. So this was very much so the evil of the day, and it didn't really help in any way whatsoever. E3, women that aren't booth babes, still hard to find at video game trade show, as, many of the publishers simply tried to get around the restriction on skimpy clothing because they still knew what people wanted to see. And as for the women themselves, they didn't complain. In fact, they had initially protests against the booth babe ban because to them, of course, this was simply depriving them of a revenue stream. This was simply saying like, oh, this was a job to you? Well, not anymore, it isn't. And that was but the first step, as this continued on for quite some time. E3 diversity report. So was it a white guy fest again? Because they hate white people. E3 2017 diversity report. Female game characters masked lack of progress. Because it was never good enough. And again, back then, we didn't know what any of these was. We were utterly confused. And E3, admittedly, understandably, was equally confused. They heard all of these claims, saying like, okay, this is bad, right? We need diversity and inclusion. We've got to get more women into it. We are a more open industry now. We're no longer serving those filthy, dirty, white, basement-dwelling gamers anymore. We are a grand and global business, and we must behave like one. Unfortunately, it turns out that the very reason why you were a grand and global business was exactly because you served those basement-dwelling white nerds. They were the ones who made you into it, and has now turned gaming into the largest entertainment industry on Earth, having actually managed to make gaming popular through the quality and the exceptional innovation and remarkable nature of video gaming in the very early 2000s. Again, I maintain that the year 2000 itself was the gold standard for video gaming, the absolute high watermark, and everything thereafter has been downhill. E3 eventually internalized all of these years of critique, and it kind of culminated in Take-Two's now rather infamous panel on diversity and inclusion, where the gaming company went to the gaming convention and decided to talk about politics rather than the video games. Didn't go over very well, surprisingly enough, and this was of course after that whole little coughing event. That's whether or not you're allowed to speak about on YouTube is still a pinch unclear, shall we say. And to be fair as well, that obviously did enormous damage to E3. In all due likelihood, the corpse of E3 could have continued dragging itself across the tiles for quite some time yet, before expiring, were it not for those events. But this was inevitable the moment they forget their fans. It'll take a while. It always takes a while. It takes a long time to burn away all the good faith that a company or an event has stored up. In the case of E3, what it needed to do to be able to outcompete the developers doing their own thing was to simply be the thing for the fans. To be like, okay, we are the Oscars, but for you. Not for the elites, not for the companies. We are your celebration. We are your party. And thus, any company that decides to decline the invitation to the party, well, why aren't you coming? Do you hate video gaming? Do you hate your customers, etc.? Because it was that celebration. It had cornered that market. It had developed that reputation, and yet it decided to throw it all under the bus year after year after year, moving further and further away from the people that they were supposed to be serving. And again, it takes a very long time. Look at Creative Assembly, for example. Creative Assembly has habitually peed all over their consumers for year after year after year after year. I mean, the general issue of garbage started with Empire, and it has taken until now for people to finally come to the realization that, oh, we are actually being mistreated at a frightening frequency. Maybe this requires a little bit more of a long-term solution to our problems, and eventually the stepping in of Sega to annihilate a couple of projects that were equally loathed by the fans. This can be seen in Star Wars as well. You gotta remember, Star Wars used to be the hottest thing ever. Absolutely ever. It used to be one of the largest entertainment entities in the world. Now, it can barely produce a TV show that breaks even. Hell, it's struggling to even do that. Everything it makes is chasing the audience because it has managed to chase off the audience. This took, what? They bought it in, Disney bought it in 2012, so it's taken them over 10 years to scour almost every last bit of goodwill out of the audience. And even then, people are still sitting there grasping on desperately to anything that even resembles good, as demonstrated by the first season of The Mandalorian, for example. It takes a very long time to destroy a fan base as intrinsically and to their own malice, mind you, loyal a fan base as gamers. And that is in large part because those of us who were here from the very beginning, we weren't popular because we liked video games. We were ostracized because we liked video games. And so when we encountered a company or an event like E3 that actually said like, no, it's okay. We understand. We actually enjoy these things too. We were like, oh my god, fantastic. It's kind of the Stockholm Syndrome, really. But that's where we are. Like, you can see this in so many settings and industries, not in industries, but within the industry of gaming, right? So many companies that have repeatedly ruined their customers and absolutely shat all over them, and yet are still forgiven the next time they make something good because we just want the good thing. That is all we want. We just want the good product. That is it. We are incredibly easy, far too easy to satisfy. That's gamers in a nutshell. And all E3 had to do was, well, do that. Focus on pleasing its primary audience. Focus on creating a culture around celebrating games instead of denouncing them as sexist, as uninclusive, as immoral, or just as, gross for liking what they like. If that had happened, E3 would still have been alive today. E3 would have survived the little Chinese pandemic and would have still have been able to thrive for quite a few years more, probably a good decade or so, before eventually probably being outcompeted by the companies. Because, well, it's very easy for Capcom to be very enthusiastic about Capcom's product, isn't it? Even if they are on the side, perhaps acting a bit less than entirely honourable around gaming. Whereas E3 needs to create a space where all the companies can receive the same amount of equal enthusiasm. They need to create a festival for all of video gaming rather than just for one aspect of it, which is more difficult and would eventually probably fall off as the internet grew more and more powerful. But again, make no mistake, E3 died first and foremost because it forgot whom it served, rather than simply being left obsolete by the advance of technology. At least that's my view on matters. I'd love to hear what your view is down in the comments section below. And as always, I've been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.